Not once, not in 8 centuries, not through civil wars, not through plague, not through the collapse of republics and the rise of emperors. Every power that rose and fell around it, Rome held. And then, on the night of August 24th, in the year 410 AD, a gate opened from the inside, and everything that had felt permanent stopped being permanent. A Gothic leader named Alaric walked into the Eternal City with his army, and for 3 days straight, the place that had ruled the known world was looted. In this video, we're going to take you through the exact sequence of events that made that night possible. Who Alaric was, what made Rome so exposed, what actually happened during those 3 days, and why the shock of it reshaped the ancient world in ways that are still visible today. To understand why this event hit the ancient world like a physical blow, you first have to understand what Rome meant, not just as a city, but as an idea. By 410, Rome was not actually the administrative center of the Western Empire anymore. The emperor hadn't been based there for years. Imperial courts had moved to other locations, especially Ravenna, a fortified city built in the northeastern marshes of Italy, surrounded by swamp, very difficult to attack, and politically insulated from what happened on the Italian peninsula. But Rome remained something that no other city in the world had, the accumulated symbolic weight of 8 centuries of the most powerful civilization the Mediterranean had ever produced. The phrase historians use, that Rome hadn't been taken by a foreign enemy in 800 years, refers all the way back to a Gallic sack around 390 BCE. In the more than 800 years between that event and 410 AD, Rome had survived every conceivable form of internal and external threat. The idea that it could fall had become almost psychologically impossible to hold on to seriously. So when it happened, the shock was not primarily military. It was civilizational, a rupture in the framework people used to understand how the world worked. The writer Jerome, writing from Bethlehem in the East, expressed something close to apocalyptic disbelief in a letter that survived the centuries. He wrote that the city which had taken the whole world had itself been taken. Those words capture exactly how the event felt to people who lived through it. Now let's establish who Alaric was, because popular history often reduces him to a simple villain, a barbarian who destroyed civilization, and that reduction misses almost everything important. Alaric was a Gothic leader, specifically a Visigoth, and the Goths were not strangers to the Roman world. They had been living inside and around Roman territory for decades, serving in Roman armies, participating in Roman trade and political structures, learning Latin, adopting Christianity in its Arian form. The Gothic presence inside imperial territory went back at least to 3776 AD, when a massive wave of Gothic people crossed the Danube River into Roman territory. They were not invading, they were fleeing. A force called the Huns was pressing in from the east with terrifying speed and violence, and the Goths needed somewhere to go. The Roman government agreed to let them in. Then it treated them catastrophically, cutting off promised food supplies, exploiting their vulnerability, subjecting them to corruption and abuse from local Roman officials. The result was the Battle of Adrianople in 378, where Gothic forces defeated a Roman army and killed the Emperor Valens. That battle was one of the most decisive military shocks in late Roman history, and it established, permanently, that Gothic power inside imperial territory could not simply be managed or suppressed. Alaric came directly out of that world. He had military experience in Roman structures and understood imperial politics from the inside. His goal was specific and consistent throughout years of conflict: recognition, a formal military command within the Roman system, land and security for his people. He was not trying to destroy Rome. He was trying to force the Roman government to give him something it kept promising and then refusing to deliver. The event that made the sack of 410 possible was not Alaric's army. It was a decision made inside the Roman imperial court in 408. For years, the most capable defender of the Western Empire had been a general named Stilicho. Stilicho was of mixed Vandal and Roman ancestry. His father was Vandal. He had risen entirely through Roman military service, and he had become the most powerful figure in the Western court, serving as the effective strongman of the Western Empire under Emperor Honorius. He had fought Alaric before and outmaneuvered him on multiple occasions. He had also negotiated with Alaric when negotiation served Roman interests better than continued costly warfare. That combination of combat and diplomacy made him effective, and made him enemies. In 408, a combination of court intrigue, factional politics, and deep Roman cultural suspicion of foreign ancestry got Stilicho accused of conspiring with Alaric. The charge was almost certainly fabricated. He was executed on the orders of Honorius. Almost immediately, there followed a series of massacres, The families of barbarian Federate soldiers serving in the Roman army were killed across Italy. These were people who had sworn military service to Rome and whose families were now being slaughtered by the government they served. Thousands of those soldiers left the Roman military and went directly to Alaric. One court decision, driven by factional jealousy and ethnic suspicion, handed Alaric a significant military reinforcement and removed the one Roman general capable of managing the threat. This is what historians mean when they describe the sack of 410 as partly a self-inflicted wound. What followed Stilicho's execution was not a single dramatic assault on the city. It was a grinding, multi-year process of siege, negotiation, ransom, and repeated failure to reach any lasting agreement. Alaric besieged Rome for the first time in 408, cutting off the grain supply that the enormous city depended on entirely. Rome's population at this point was still one of the largest in the world, and every grain of food that fed it had to come from outside. Once that supply was cut, hunger arrived quickly, and panic followed. The Roman Senate, left without imperial military protection, eventually negotiated a ransom. The terms recorded in ancient sources are extraordinary. Thousands of pounds of gold, thousands of pounds of silver, thousands of pieces of silk clothing, 3,000 pounds of pepper, and other valuables. The pepper detail has fascinated historians for centuries because it illustrates how deeply connected to long-distance luxury trade Rome still was, and how precisely Alaric understood what the city contained. But the ransom bought only time, not resolution. The underlying conflict, Alaric wanting formal recognition and settlement, the Roman court refusing to give it, remained completely unresolved. Emperor Honorius remained safely behind the marshes of Ravenna, physically untouchable, and therefore politically unmoved. He had no immediate personal incentive to negotiate seriously. In 409, Alaric made a move that shows how completely the old political order had already shattered. He backed the elevation of a rival emperor, a senator named Priscus Attalus, with support from parts of the Roman Senate. A Gothic war leader was now choosing who should sit on the Roman throne. But Attalus couldn't deliver the military success Alaric needed, and Alaric eventually withdrew his support. The cycle of siege, partial negotiation, ransom, and breakdown continued, one more time, until August 24th, 410. The night of August 24th, 410 is the date that appears in the ancient sources, though, as with many events from this era, the exact details are imperfectly preserved. The most widely repeated account says the Salarian Gate, one of Rome's major city entrances on the northeastern side, was opened from within. Some accounts say slaves did it. Others say sympathizers inside the city. The specifics are not fully known. What is not disputed is what followed. Once inside the walls, Alaric's Visigoths moved through Rome. What followed was 3 days of looting, not a single catastrophic day, which is worth noting because the video's title uses single day as a frame for the breakthrough moment, not the entire sack. The breakthrough was the gate opening on a single night. The sack itself lasted 3 days. And this is where the history needs some precision, because the popular imagination about this event often swings to one of two extremes. One extreme imagines total obliteration, every building leveled, every person killed, the whole city reduced to ash. The other extreme minimizes the event. It wasn't that bad, Rome survived. Both are wrong. Senatorial wealth was seized on a massive scale. Aristocratic households were ransacked and stripped. Galla Placidia, the emperor's own sister, was taken during the crisis and would spend years with the Goths before eventually returning to imperial life and becoming one of the most important political figures in the late Western Empire. There was violence, killing, terror, and the kind of permanent psychological damage that comes from watching the most powerful symbol in your civilization be treated as loot. But Rome was not physically destroyed. Multiple ancient Christian sources record that the churches of the apostles Peter and Paul functioned as sanctuaries during the sack and were respected. This detail became enormously important to Christian writers afterward. Emperor Honorius occupies one of the stranger positions in all of late Roman history, and it's worth giving him proper attention. He has been remembered for centuries as weak, detached, and politically inadequate, and ancient sources did him few favors. A story circulated in Antiquity that when a messenger brought news of Rome's fall to Ravenna, Honorius initially panicked, then visibly relaxed when he realized the messenger was referring to the city, not to his pet chicken, which was also named Rome. Modern historians debate whether this story is true or a later satirical invention. What it captures about the structural reality is completely accurate. The emperor was safe in his marsh fortress while the symbolic and historical center of his civilization was being looted. He had negotiated poorly, refused multiple opportunities to give Alaric the formal settlement that might have prevented the crisis, presided over the execution of the one general who could have managed the military threat, and stood by while the slaughter of barbarian Federate families ensured Alaric's army grew instead of shrank. The contrast between Ravenna's defensibility for the emperor personally and Rome's exposure symbolically is one of the defining ironies of the late Western Empire. The shock that followed the sack of 410 spread through the ancient world in ways that were more than political. Refugees fled Italy. News traveled along every trade route. In the Eastern Empire, in North Africa, in the provinces of Gaul and Spain, people who had built their entire mental model of the world around Roman permanence were now confronting evidence that the permanence was gone. The theological debate that erupted was as intense as the political one. Pagan critics made a direct accusation. Rome had abandoned its traditional gods by converting to Christianity under Constantine and his successors, and now those gods had withdrawn their protection. The sack of 410 was, in this reading, a divine punishment for religious betrayal. This was not a fringe argument, it was the dominant interpretation among those who still practiced the old religion. Christian thinkers needed a serious response. Augustine of Hippo, the Bishop of Hippo in North Africa, and one of the most important theological minds in all of Christian history, began writing his masterwork, The City of God, directly in response to this challenge. His argument was careful and philosophically profound. No earthly city, no matter how ancient or powerful, should ever be confused with the eternal city of God. Rome's fall proved not that Christianity had failed, but that all human political structures are inherently temporary. The true city that believers should care about is not built in stone and cannot be sacked. That argument, forged in the immediate aftermath of 410, became one of the foundational texts of Christian political theology and shaped how European civilization thought about the relationship between faith and political power for the next 1,000 years. Alaric did not convert the sack into permanent occupation or political control of the Western Empire. He moved south through Italy after the looting, apparently with ambitions related to the grain-producing provinces of North Africa. But he never made it. He died later in the year 410, before those plans could develop. According to the Visigoth historian Jordanes, writing over a century later, Alaric was buried in a river in southern Italy. His followers diverted the river, buried him beneath it, and then redirected the water back so his grave would never be found and never be desecrated. Whether this is literally true or legendary embellishment, it captures the significance the Visigoths placed on their leader's death. Leadership passed to Atholf, who eventually led the Visigoths north and west, first into Gaul and then into Spain. The Western Roman Empire didn't collapse in 410. The imperial structure continued for another 66 years, until 476, when the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was quietly deposed. Rome itself survived as a city, remained inhabited, and continued as the spiritual center of Latin Christianity. But 410 broke something that could not be repaired. Here is what makes 410 historically unique, even in a century of Roman crisis. It was not the most destructive event in Roman history. The Antonine Plague and the Plague of Cyprian had killed far more people. The 3rd century crisis had nearly disintegrated the empire from within. Adrianople, in 378, was a more decisive single military defeat. But 410 was the symbolic rupture, the moment when Rome's inviolability died publicly and visibly. That distinction between military defeat and symbolic collapse matters enormously in how events shape history. The 410 sack mattered because it made Rome's mortality visible to the millions of people who had organized their lives around the assumption that it was not mortal. The Vandals would sack Rome again in 455, and by many scholarly accounts, that sack was more systematically destructive in terms of material looting. But it didn't carry the same civilizational weight because the belief in Roman permanence was already broken. The 410 sack was the first time, the moment of rupture, and first blows against a belief land fundamentally differently than all subsequent confirmation. There is one more dimension of the 410 sack that is often overlooked in favor of the dramatic narrative, what it revealed about the internal social structure of the late Western Empire. The ransom paid to Alaric in 408, gold, silver, silk, and pepper, came primarily from the Roman Senate. The Senate, as an institution, still represented immense private wealth concentrated in the hands of a small number of aristocratic families. Those families owned vast estates across Italy, North Africa, and the western provinces. They had survived the transition from republic to empire, survived multiple dynastic upheavals, survived plague and economic contraction. But they had also steadily retreated from direct military service and political responsibility in favor of managing their estates and negotiating favorable relationships with whoever held power in a given moment. This created a structural problem that the sack of 410 exposed in stark terms. The city of Rome was enormously symbolically valuable, still enormously materially wealthy, but it was not militarily defended in any way that matched its importance. The gap between Rome's symbolic status and its actual military protection had been quietly widening for decades. Alaric didn't create that gap. He simply walked through it. The material scale of the looting in 410 is worth dwelling on for a moment because it tells a story about what Rome still was, even in apparent decline. Ancient sources, including Procopius writing over a century later, record that the Visigoths carried out of Rome the treasures of the temple in Jerusalem, the seven-branched menorah, the golden table, and other sacred objects, which Titus had brought to Rome after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Whether every specific item listed in later sources was actually taken is debated by historians, but the broad scope of the looting was not in doubt. Senatorial households that had accumulated wealth across generations were stripped. Galla Placidia, the imperial princess, was taken and would live among the Visigoths for years before eventually marrying Athalf, Alaric's successor. Her subsequent return to imperial life and her role as regent for her son Valentinian III made her one of the most consequential women in late Western Roman history, a direct human consequence of the events of 410. The 3 days of looting were also 3 days during which the population of the city experienced something that no living Roman had any framework to understand. The Eternal City was being treated as a prize. The monuments, the households, the wealth accumulated over centuries, all of it was accessible to a force that Roman ideology had always defined as external, inferior, and ultimately controllable. That psychological break, the confrontation with the reality that none of the old categories held anymore, is what contemporary rewriters were trying to process in the years and decades that followed. So where does this leave us? The sack of 410 was not just a military event. It was the moment when Rome's story stopped being one of inevitable permanence and became one of visible, undeniable vulnerability. Alaric succeeded partly because of his own capability and persistence, but mostly because the Western Empire had made every possible mistake on the way to that gate, executing Stilicho, brutalizing the families of the soldiers it depended on, negotiating in bad faith across multiple years, and leaving Rome militarily exposed while the emperor sat safely in the marshes. The event was a self-inflicted wound as much as an outside attack, which is one of the things that makes it so uncomfortable and so endlessly studied. The 3 days of looting in August of 410 didn't end the Roman Empire. But they ended the assumption that the Roman Empire was permanent, and once that assumption was gone, the 66 years between 410 and the final fall in 476 took on a completely different character. Provincial governors began making decisions with a shorter time horizon. Military commanders hedged their loyalty. Church leaders began building institutions that could survive without imperial backing. The political behavior of the entire Western Mediterranean shifted after 410 in ways that historians can trace through documents, laws, and decisions made in the years that followed. None of those shifts were announced. None were declared. They were the slow, practical adaptation of a civilization to evidence it could no longer ignore. And in that sense, August 410 was not just the week Rome was looted. It was the week the Western world's operating assumptions were permanently updated, and the long work of imagining what came after Rome could finally begin in earnest. If this video opened up a corner of history you want to go deeper on, there's a follow-up looking at what the decades between 410 and the final fall of the Western Empire in 476 actually looked like from the inside, the crumbling courts, the final emperors, and the moment the last man to hold the title was simply told he wasn't needed anymore. That video is linked right now at the end of this screen.